The strange thing about humiliation is that sometimes it says more about the person giving it than the person receiving it. And the night Adrian Romano left me a $1 tip was the night his world quietly began to change. I remember the rain first. Manhattan rain has a way of turning the sidewalks into mirrors, reflecting the city lights until everything looks a little unreal. I stood behind the hostess stand at Bellucci's Steakhouse, adjusting the thin black apron around my waist for what felt like the 100th time that evening. My shift had started at 4, it was already past 9, and my feet felt like they had walked 10 miles across concrete floors. Friday nights were always chaos. Wealthy businessmen celebrating deals, tourists ordering steaks they couldn't pronounce, couples trying to impress each other over overpriced wine. It was the kind of place where people believed the size of the tip proved the size of their importance. I had just balanced 3 plates of ribeye and garlic mashed potatoes when the restaurant changed. You could feel it before you saw it. Conversations softened. Chairs straightened. Even a manager suddenly stood a little taller near the entrance. Someone important had arrived. The front doors opened and a group of men stepped inside, their dark coats damp from the rain. In the center of them walked a man who didn't need to say a word for the entire room to notice him. Adrian Romano. I didn't know his name yet. I only noticed the details first. The tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The calm way he moved, like the entire restaurant belonged to him and everyone inside it simply hadn't realized it yet. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. But power has a strange gravity. It pulls attention without asking. Marco, our manager, hurried toward him with the biggest smile I had ever seen him wear. Mr. Romano, welcome back. Welcome back. So he was a regular. Great. That meant he would expect perfection. Marco turned and scanned the dining room before his eyes landed on me. Emily, he said quickly, lowering his voice, table 12. VIP service. Of course. Table 12 was the worst table in the restaurant. Not because of the location, but because every server knew the guests who sat there expected more than just good service. They expected obedience. I carried a tray of water glasses across the room, my heartbeat strangely louder than usual. When I reached the table, Adrian Romano looked up from the menu. His eyes were dark, calm, observant. Not the distracted look most wealthy customers had. He studied people the way chess players studied a board. Good evening, I said, keeping my voice steady. My name is Emily, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. He nodded once, polite but distant. The kind of nod that acknowledged your existence without truly noticing you. The meal went smoothly. Perfect steaks, perfect wine pairings, perfect timing. Adrian Romano barely spoke, but I felt his attention occasionally flick toward me as I cleared plates and refilled glasses. Not in a rude way, just curious, like he was solving a quiet puzzle. When the bill finally arrived, I placed the check folder on the table and stepped away. 10 minutes later, I returned to collect it. The receipt was signed. Neat handwriting. Controlled. On the tip line, there was a number written so small it almost looked like a mistake. $1. Just one. I stared at it for a moment, certain I had read it wrong. But no, the math was correct. A $200 dinner. $1 tip. Not an accident. A message. I felt heat rise behind my ears as the other servers nearby noticed. Some looked sympathetic. Others just looked relieved it wasn't their table. I closed the check folder slowly. Then I picked up the single-dollar bill resting inside. And that was the moment I made the decision that Adrian Romano would never forget. For a few seconds, I simply stood there beside table 12 holding that single-dollar bill between my fingers while the noise of the restaurant continued around me like nothing unusual had happened. Glasses clinked. Laughter floated from a bar. Somewhere behind me, a steak sizzled on the grill. But the small piece of paper in my hand felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the money, because of the message. $1 did not happen by accident in a place like Bellucci's. Every person who worked there understood tipping culture the way cab drivers understood traffic lights. 20% meant satisfaction. 15% meant something went slightly wrong. 10% meant the customer was irritated. $1 meant something else entirely. It meant the customer wanted you to know exactly what they thought of you. I could feel the other servers watching from across the dining room. Jessica near the bar raised her eyebrows slightly, as if asking whether it was really true. Daniel by the wine station looked away quickly in the polite way people did when they did not want to stare at embarrassment. I slipped the bill into my palm and closed the black check folder slowly. I should have walked away. That was the rule in restaurants. Smile, nod, move on to the next table. Pride did not pay rent, but something about the quiet confidence of the man who had left it behind kept replaying in my mind. The calm way he had watched the room, the certainty in his posture. He had not made a scene. He had not complained. He had simply written $1, as if the gesture itself was the conversation. I glanced across the dining room. Adrian Romano still sat at the table with his associates. They were finishing their drinks, speaking quietly among themselves. He looked relaxed, one arm resting on the back of the chair, the faint glow of the chandelier reflecting off his watch. For a moment, I wondered if perhaps I had misunderstood. Maybe it really had been a mistake. Maybe the man simply wrote the wrong number while distracted. But something inside me rejected that explanation immediately. People who moved through the world with that level of certainty did not make careless mistakes about money. I took a slow breath. My manager Marco passed behind me carrying a tray and whispered quickly without stopping. "Emily, just leave it. Not worth it." That told me everything I needed to know. Marco had seen it too, and he expected me to accept it quietly. I looked down at the dollar again. The edges were slightly worn from circulation. A perfectly ordinary bill. But right then it felt like a small test someone had placed on the table to see what I would do. I wiped my hands on my apron, straightened my shoulders, and picked up the bill. My heart beat faster as I walked back across the dining room. Every step suddenly felt louder against the polished wood floor. Adrian Romano noticed me approaching before I reached the table. His eyes lifted slowly from his glass of sparkling water and followed my movement with calm curiosity. His associates fell silent as I stopped beside the table. For one brief second I hesitated. Then I placed the dollar gently on the white tablecloth in front of him. The bill slid across the linen and came to rest beside the signed receipt. "Sir," I said, keeping my voice steady enough for only the table to hear, "I think you might need this more than I do." The words hung in the air between us. One of the men across from him blinked in surprise. Another leaned back slightly in his chair. But Adrian Romano did not move at first. He simply looked down at the dollar bill, then back up at me, and something about his expression changed. Not anger, not embarrassment, something closer to interest. Like a man who had just discovered that a quiet evening had suddenly become much more entertaining than he expected. For a moment, the entire table remained silent as Adrian Romano looked at the dollar bill resting on the white tablecloth between us. The soft lighting of the restaurant reflected off the glassware and polished silver, but his attention stayed fixed on that single piece of paper as if it had suddenly become the most interesting object in the room. Then slowly he leaned back in his chair, not offended, not embarrassed, just studying me with a quiet focus that made my pulse quicken. One of the men sitting across from him cleared his throat as if unsure whether to laugh or apologize for me. Another shifted in his seat and glanced toward the manager's station. In a restaurant like Bellucci's, scenes like this were not supposed to happen. Servers did not challenge guests. Guests did not get questioned. The entire system worked because everyone silently agreed to play their roles. But at that moment the roles had changed and everyone could feel it. Adrian Romano reached forward and picked up the dollar bill with 2 fingers, turning it slowly as if inspecting it under the chandelier light. His expression remained calm, but there was something different in his eyes now. Curiosity, real curiosity. "You returned it," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. His accent carried a faint trace of something European, softened by years in New York. I nodded once. "Yes, sir." The man sitting beside him gave a short laugh. Under his breath, clearly expecting the moment to escalate into irritation or a lecture about customer service. But Adrian Romano did neither. Instead, he looked at the bill again, then placed it back on the table exactly where it had been before. "Most people would keep it," he said. I shrugged lightly. "Most people probably need it more." The man across the table nearly choked on his drink at that response. Marco, my manager, had appeared halfway across the dining room and was now frozen beside the wine cabinet watching the exchange with an expression that said he was mentally calculating whether he was about to lose a valuable customer or a stubborn employee. Adrian Romano noticed him too. His eyes flicked briefly toward Marco, then back to me. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not quite a smile. More like someone acknowledging a surprising move in a chess match. "You are not worried about your job?" he asked. I thought about that question for a moment before answering honestly. "I'm always worried about my job," I said, "but I'm more worried about my self-respect." The words sounded calmer than I felt inside. My heart was still beating faster than usual, but something about saying the truth out loud made the fear fade a little. Adrian Romano studied my face for another long second. The restaurant noise returned slowly around us, as nearby diners pretended not to listen while clearly listening to every word. Finally, he exhaled softly through his nose, as if amused by something only he understood. "Interesting," he said quietly. One of his associates leaned toward him and murmured something I could not hear, but Adrian raised one hand slightly, and the man immediately fell silent again. The gesture was small, but it carried authority that needed no explanation. Adrian looked back at me. "Emily, correct?" My stomach tightened slightly. "Yes." The fact that he remembered my name was unexpected. Most customers barely glanced at the name printed on the receipt. He nodded once as if confirming something in his mind. Then he folded the dollar bill and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. "You may be the first person in a long time who has returned money to me," he said. I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply held his gaze without speaking. A few seconds passed. Then he stood from the table, tall enough that I suddenly noticed how easily he commanded the space around him. His chair slid back quietly against the floor. The men with him immediately stood as well. Adrian Romano adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket and glanced toward the door, where rain continued to streak the tall front windows of the restaurant. Then he looked back at me one last time. "Emily," he said, his voice calm but thoughtful. "I think tonight just became more interesting than I expected." And something about the way he said it made me realize that returning that $1 might have started something neither of us had planned. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm after Adrian Romano and his associates walked out into the rain, but the atmosphere around table 12 felt different, like the air itself had shifted slightly. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching the tall glass doors close behind him as the city lights blurred across the wet street outside. Then Marco appeared beside me, so suddenly that I almost dropped the empty check folder still in my hand. "Emily," he said under his breath, the tightness in his voice barely hidden. "What exactly was that?" I knew that tone. It was the same tone managers used when they were trying to stay calm, while calculating whether something had just gone very wrong. I placed the folder under my arm and met his gaze. "He left $1, I said simply. Marco rubbed his forehead like a man trying to prevent a headache. "Yes, I saw that part." His eyes flicked toward the door where Adrian had disappeared. "Do you have any idea who that was?" I shook my head. "A customer." Marco let out a short breath that sounded halfway between frustration and disbelief. That was Adrian Romano. The name meant nothing to me, but the way Marco said it clearly meant it was supposed to. "Should I know who that is?" I asked. Marco stared at me for a long second before answering quietly. "Let us just say he is not the kind of person most people return money to." I considered that for a moment while the sounds of the restaurant continued around us. Glasses clinked. A server called for an order pickup near the kitchen. Life at Bellucci's moved forward quickly, even after awkward moments. "Well," I said calmly, "he has his dollar back now." Marco studied my face as if trying to determine whether I was joking or simply reckless. Finally, he sighed and straightened his tie. "Just finish your shift," he muttered. "And please try not to challenge any more influential guests tonight." I nodded and returned to my section, though the conversation replayed in my mind while I carried plates and refilled drinks. Adrian Romano. The name still meant nothing to me, but there had been something unusual about him. Not just the suit or the confidence. Plenty of wealthy men walked into Bellucci's every week. Most of them blurred together after a while. But Adrian Romano had watched people the way someone watched a story unfold. Calm, observant, curious, as if he expected the world to eventually reveal something interesting. By the time my shift ended close to midnight, the rain outside had softened to a mist that hung in the air like silver dust under the streetlights. I changed out of my apron, grabbed my coat, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. Manhattan at night always felt like a different city. Quieter, slower. The taxis moved past with glowing roof lights, and the smell of damp pavement mixed with the distant aroma of street food from a late-night cart on the corner. I began the short walk toward the subway entrance 2 blocks away, my shoes clicking lightly against the sidewalk. My mind was already shifting toward ordinary concerns again. Rent due next week. My younger brother's college textbooks that still needed to be paid for. The usual calculations that fill my head every evening. I had almost reached the corner when a black sedan pulled smoothly to the curb nearby. I barely noticed it at first. In New York, black cars were as common as pigeons. But then the rear passenger door opened. I slowed slightly, instinctively glancing toward the movement. Adrian Romano stepped out from the car, adjusting the sleeve of his coat as the soft mist settled on his shoulders. For a second, I wondered if it was coincidence. Manhattan was a big city. People crossed paths all the time. But then his eyes found mine immediately, like he had expected me to be there. He took a few calm steps closer, stopping just far enough away to remain polite. The street light above us reflected in the rain behind him, turning the pavement into a shimmering mirror. "Good evening again, Emily," he said, his voice carrying the same calm control it had inside the restaurant. I felt a flicker of surprise, but kept my posture steady. "Good evening," I replied. Adrian Romano studied me for a brief moment before speaking again. "You returned something to me tonight," he said thoughtfully. "That does not happen often." I slipped my hands into the pockets of my coat against the cool air. "It was only $1, I said. The faintest hint of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "No," he replied quietly. "It was not only $1. Adrian Romano's words lingered in the cool night air between us as the mist drifted slowly through the glow of the streetlight above the sidewalk. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Taxis passed along the avenue, their tires whispering across the damp pavement, and somewhere down the block a subway train rumbled beneath the city like distant thunder. I studied him carefully now that we were no longer separated by the polished formality of Bellucci's dining room. Without the restaurant lights and the quiet orchestra music, he looked slightly different, still composed, still confident, but less like a customer and more like someone used to moving through the city on his own terms. "Then what was it?" I asked finally. Adrian Romano tilted his head slightly, considering the question as if he appreciated the directness of it. "It was a refusal," he said. "Most people would have taken the money, even if they felt insulted. Pride becomes flexible when bills are waiting." I shrugged lightly. Pride is cheaper than rent. The corner of his mouth lifted again in that almost smile I had noticed earlier. It was not the kind of smile meant to charm people. It looked more like the reaction of someone discovering an unexpected detail in a story. He glanced briefly toward the subway entrance behind me. "You take the train home?" he asked. "Most nights." "You live far?" "Queens." Adrian nodded slowly, as if storing that information away somewhere. The black sedan behind him waited quietly at the curb, its driver seated patiently behind the wheel. The entire scene felt oddly calm, like a conversation that had been scheduled even though it had not. "You work many hours," he said. I laughed softly. That is usually how jobs work. For the first time, his smile became slightly more visible. "True," he admitted, "but not everyone carries themselves the way you do after a long shift." I folded my arms loosely against the cool air. How do I carry myself? Adrian Romano studied me for a moment before answering, like someone who is not impressed by expensive suits. I glanced briefly at the coat he was wearing. "You noticed that?" "Of course," he replied calmly. "I noticed most things." That statement was not arrogant. It was simply factual. The confidence in his voice suggested a man who had spent years observing the world carefully. For a few seconds, the only sound between us was the soft patter of mist hitting the pavement. Then Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. My eyes followed the motion automatically. He pulled out the folded dollar bill and held it between two fingers. "You gave this back," he said, "which makes it unusual." I raised an eyebrow. "It is still just $1." Adrian shook his head slightly. "Money is rarely about the amount," he said. "It is about the meaning people attach to it." He stepped closer to the curb and held the bill up toward the streetlight, examining it again like a curious artifact. "You returned something that most people would have kept," he continued, "which makes me wonder what else you refused to accept." I leaned lightly against the cool metal pole of the street sign beside me. "I refuse a lot of things," I said. "Bad tips, bad attitudes, and sometimes bad conversations." His eyes lifted from the bill to meet mine again. For a brief moment, there was a spark of something brighter in his expression. "Respect, perhaps, or intrigue." "Then I should be careful," he said, "because I am about to ask you a question." I gestured slightly with one hand. "That depends on the question." Adrian Romano folded the dollar carefully and slipped it back into his pocket again. The gesture felt deliberate, as if he was placing a bookmark inside a story he planned to return to later. "Why did you really give it back?" he asked quietly. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I watched the reflection of city lights ripple across the wet pavement while I considered the truth. Finally, I looked back at him. "Because if I had kept it," I said, "then your message would have been correct." Adrian Romano did not speak for several seconds after that. He simply held my gaze with the calm patience of someone who understood exactly what I meant. And then slowly, almost thoughtfully, he nodded once, as if a piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. Adrian Romano's quiet nod lingered in the space between us as the mist continued drifting through the glow of the streetlights. And for a moment it felt as if the entire city had slowed down just enough for the conversation to settle. Cars moved past on the avenue. A bus sighed to a stop half a block away. Somewhere behind me, the subway entrance hummed with the sound of late-night commuters moving down the stairs. Adrian slipped his hands calmly into the pockets of his coat, studying me with that same patient attention he had shown across the restaurant table earlier. "You are a difficult person to categorize, Emily," he said after a moment. I tilted my head slightly. I did not realize I was being categorized. "Everyone is," he replied evenly. "Most people simply never notice when it happens." I considered that while a taxi rolled slowly past the curb beside us, its headlights reflecting off the wet pavement like ribbons of light. "And what category did you expect me to fit into?" I asked. Adrian glanced briefly toward the street before answering. "The predictable one." I laughed softly. "That sounds convenient." "It usually is," he said. "Predictable people make simple decisions." I shifted my weight slightly against the metal pole behind me. "And unpredictable people?" Adrian looked back at me with a calm expression. "They make interesting ones." The driver of the black sedan stepped out of the car quietly and opened the rear door, but Adrian lifted a hand slightly without turning around. The driver paused immediately, closing the door again and returning to the front seat without a word. The small exchange told me more about Adrian Romano than anything Marco had said earlier inside the restaurant. People around him listened carefully, not because he raised his voice, because he did not need to. "You should probably go," I said after a moment, nodding toward the car. "It looks like someone is waiting." Adrian glanced over, his shoulder briefly, and then back at me. "He is patient." "Still," I said, "most people with expensive cars have somewhere to be." "Usually," Adrian replied. "But tonight I was curious about something." I folded my arms lightly against the cool air. "About the dollar?" "About you." His answer came without hesitation, and the simplicity of it made me pause for half a second. I had worked in restaurants long enough to know when customers were trying to flirt or impress someone. This felt different. Adrian Romano was not trying to charm me. He sounded like a man studying an unusual detail he had not expected to find. "That seems like a strange thing to be curious about," I said. "Does it?" he asked calmly. "Most people react to disrespect in predictable ways. Anger, embarrassment, silence. You chose something else." "I chose honesty," I said. Adrian nodded slightly. "Yes. For a moment, he looked toward the glowing windows of Bellucci's down the street, as if replaying the evening in his mind. "Do you enjoy working there?" he asked. The question caught me slightly off guard. Enjoy is not the word I would use, I admitted. But it pays the bills. "And the train ride to Queens?" he asked. 45 minutes on a good night, I said. "Sometimes longer." Adrian seemed to consider that information quietly. Then he turned back toward me again. "You returned the dollar because you refused to accept the message attached to it," he said slowly. "Which means something else about you." "What is that?" I asked. Adrian's expression grew thoughtful again, the same focused look he had worn earlier when studying the bill under the restaurant lights. "It means you understand value," he said. "Not the price of things. The meaning of them." I shrugged slightly. "That sounds more impressive than it really is." Adrian shook his head once. "No, it is rare." The mist thickened slightly as a cool breeze moved down the street, carrying the faint smell of rain and distant food carts closing for the night. I glanced toward the subway entrance again. "My train is probably coming soon," I said. Adrian followed my gaze briefly before nodding. "Of course." He stepped back half a pace then, creating a little more space between us in a gesture that felt surprisingly respectful. "Good night, Emily." I pushed myself away from the pole and began walking toward the subway stairs. After a few steps, I glanced back over my shoulder. Adrian Romano had not moved yet. He stood beside the black sedan, watching the city with the calm patience of someone who is used to waiting for the right moment in any situation. And as I disappeared down the subway steps, I had the strange feeling that the small decision I made over a single dollar bill had started a conversation that was far from finished. I slept less than 4 hours that night, not because of anything dramatic, but because my mind kept replaying the same quiet conversation under the streetlight. It was not the dollar. It was not even Adrian Romano himself. It was the strange, calm certainty in the way he observed people, like he was reading a book that everyone else was still trying to understand. By the time my alarm rang at 6:30 in the morning, the city outside my Queens apartment was already alive with the usual weekday rhythm. Delivery trucks groaned along the street below. A neighbor's radio hummed faintly through the wall. I poured cheap coffee into a chipped mug and checked the time while scanning the small stack of bills on my kitchen counter. Rent. Utilities. My younger brother Ethan's college bookstore receipt that he had tried to hide from me last week. Life had a way of reminding you what really mattered before your brain could wander too far in a strange late-night encounters with mysterious men in expensive coats. By the time I arrived at Bellucci's for the evening shift, the restaurant already smelled like garlic butter and fresh bread. Marco stood near the bar reviewing reservations on a tablet, while 2 servers argued quietly about table assignments. The normal chaos of the dinner rush beginning to form. I tied my apron behind my back and reached for a tray when Marco suddenly looked up at me. "Emily," he said. His tone was different than usual, less impatient, more cautious. "Can I ask you something?" I shrugged. "You usually do." He lowered his voice slightly and leaned across the bar. "What exactly did you say to Adrian Romano last night?" I paused mid-movement. "About the dollar?" Marco nodded quickly. "Yes, about the dollar." I considered how to explain it in a way that sounded less dramatic than it probably had looked. "From across the dining room." I gave it back, I said simply. Marco rubbed his temple again like he had done the night before. "I know that part." He lowered his voice even further. "What did you say?" I repeated the line quietly. I told him he might need it more than I do. Marco stared at me for a long second before exhaling slowly. "You are either the bravest person I know," he muttered, "or the most dangerously honest." I reached for a stack of menus. "Those are sometimes the same thing." Marco shook his head slightly and went back to the reservation screen, but I could still feel him glancing toward the front door every few minutes like he expected something unusual to happen. The dinner rush started quickly after that. Tables filled, orders stacked up in the kitchen window. The normal rhythm of restaurant work returned and slowly pushed last night's conversation to the back of my mind. Plates moved, glasses refilled. Another evening of polite smiles and careful balance. About an hour into the shift, the front door opened again. I did not notice at first because I was setting down a basket of bread at table 7. But the restaurant changed the same way it had the night before. Conversations softened. Chairs shifted slightly. Marco looked up from behind the bar with the same tight expression he had worn 24 hours earlier. I followed his gaze toward the entrance. Adrian Romano had returned. He stepped inside with the same calm confidence, his dark coat folded neatly over one arm, while rain mist clung lightly to his shoulders. The host greeted him quickly, clearly nervous but professional. Adrian nodded politely, scanning the dining room once before his eyes landed on me across the floor. For a brief moment, our gazes met. His expression did not show surprise. If anything, it looked almost satisfied, like a man confirming a detail he had expected to find. Marco appeared beside me again, so quietly that I nearly dropped the breadbasket. "Emily," he whispered. "He asked for your section." I blinked once. "That sounds like a bad idea." Marco shook his head slowly. "Maybe," he said, but he insisted. I looked toward table 12, where the host was already leading Adrian Romano back to the same seat he had occupied the night before. And something about the calm way he walked across the room made it clear that the conversation under the streetlight had not ended. It had simply moved to the next chapter. The moment I saw Adrian Romano take his seat at table 12 again, I understood something immediately. This was not coincidence. People like him did not return to restaurants on consecutive nights for casual reasons. I picked up a water pitcher from the service station and walked toward the table, my steps steady even though I could feel several pairs of eyes following the situation from across the dining room. Marco pretended to polish glasses behind the bar while watching every movement. Two servers near the kitchen doorway whispered quietly to each other, clearly curious about what would happen next. Adrian Romano sat alone this time. No asociates, no business partners. Just him, a folded napkin, and the calm expression of someone who had chosen exactly where he wanted to be. When I reached the table, he looked up at me with the same composed attention I remembered from the night before. "Good evening, Emily," he said. His voice carried the same quiet confidence, but there was something warmer in it now. I placed a water glass in front of him and filled it carefully. "Good evening," I replied. "Back so soon." Adrian's lips curved slightly. "I believe you told me yesterday that most expensive cars have somewhere to be." I nodded once. "That sounds familiar." "Tonight," he continued, resting his hands lightly on the table, "I decided this was where I wanted to be." I set the water pitcher down and reached for the menu. "Well, I hope the food lives up to the return visit." Adrian did not take the menu. Instead, he watched me for a moment like someone studying a familiar page in a book. "Actually," he said calmly, "I already know what I want." I raised an eyebrow slightly. That was fast. It was decided yesterday. That response made me pause for half a second before I realized he was still talking about the conversation outside the restaurant. I cleared my throat lightly. "So what will you be having tonight?" Adrian glanced briefly around the dining room before answering. "I would like the same steak I had yesterday." "Medium rare?" I asked. "Exactly." I wrote the order down on my small notepad and started to step away when he spoke again. "Emily." I stopped and looked back at him. "Yes." Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket slowly. My eyes followed the motion automatically. He pulled out the same folded dollar bill and placed it gently on the table between us. The small piece of paper rested against the white linen cloth like a quiet reminder of the entire strange conversation that had started the night before. "You forgot something," he said. I looked at the bill and shook my head. "No, irroblia calmly." I returned it. Adrian nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Yes," he said thoughtfully, "but I kept it." He tapped the bill lightly with one finger. "It has become an interesting reminder." I crossed my arms lightly while standing beside the table. "A reminder of what?" Adrian leaned back in his chair slightly, the chandelier light reflecting softly across the polished surface of the table. "Of the first person in a long time who treated me like an ordinary customer instead of a powerful man." The honesty in that statement caught me slightly off guard. I studied his expression carefully, looking for any sign that he was joking or exaggerating. But Adrian Romano did not look like a man who wasted words on jokes. "You are still a customer," I said finally. Adrian shook his head slowly. "Perhaps," he replied. "But tonight, I am also something else." I tilted my head slightly. "And what is that?" Adrian Romano picked up the dollar bill again and folded it carefully before sliding it back in his pocket. His eyes lifted to meet mine with quiet certainty. Someone who wants to understand why a waitress in Manhattan refused to accept a message most people would not question. The dining room buzzed softly around us while I considered his words. Finally, I reached for the water pitcher again and gave a small shrug. "Maybe," I said, "because some messages are not worth accepting." Adrian Romano watched me for another moment. Then slowly, almost approvingly, he nodded again like a man who had just confirmed another important detail in the story he was reading. The rest of the evening passed with the strange calm of something quietly unfolding beneath the surface of an ordinary shift. Orders came and went. Plates moved from the kitchen to the dining room and back again. Customers laughed, celebrated birthdays, and argued about wine selections the way they did every night at Bellucci's. Yet every time I passed table 12, I could feel Adrian Romano observing the room with that same patient attention, like a man who had decided to watch a story instead of rushing through it. His steak arrived exactly the way he had ordered it, medium rare with roasted potatoes and grilled asparagus. While I placed the plate in front of him, he thanked me with a small nod, the kind that carried genuine appreciation rather than the automatic politeness many customers used. For a while, he simply ate quietly while I worked the rest of my section, but I noticed something unusual as the night continued. Adrian Romano was not paying attention to his phone. He was not holding meetings with business associates. Instead, he seemed interested in the simple rhythm of the restaurant itself. The way servers moved between tables. The way the kitchen window filled and emptied with orders. The way conversations rose and faded like background music. Once, when I stopped to refill his water glass, he spoke again. "You move quickly," he said. I glanced down at my watch. That is usually the goal in restaurants. Adrian shook his head slightly. "No," he said calmly. "I mean efficiently. You notice everything around you." I shrugged lightly. "You have to. Otherwise, someone complains." Adrian leaned back in his chair, considering that answer. "Observation is a valuable skill," he said quietly. "Most people are too distracted to practice it." I thought about that while setting the water pitcher back on the tray. "You seem pretty good at it yourself," I replied. Adrian's expression softened slightly, almost amused. "It has been useful in my life." The conversation paused there while another table called my name from across the room. I excused myself and continued working, but each time I returned to table 12, the strange sense of calm curiosity around Adrian Romano remained. By the time dessert menus appeared across the dining room, the dinner rush had started to slow. The soft music playing from the speakers sounded clearer now that fewer voices competed with it. Adrian had finished his meal and pushed the plate slightly forward on the table. I approached with the check folder already prepared. "Would you like dessert tonight?" I asked. Adrian glanced briefly at the menu before shaking his head. "No dessert," he said. "Just the check." I placed the folder on the table and stepped away, giving him space while I cleared another table nearby. A few minutes later, he closed the folder and waited quietly until I returned. When I picked it up, I noticed something immediately different. The receipt was signed neatly, just like the night before. But this time the tip line contained a number that made me pause for half a second. It was generous, far more generous than the standard 20% most customers left. I looked up at him. Adrian Romano met my gaze calmly. "Is something wrong?" he asked. I hesitated, remembering the dollar bill from the night before and the conversation that had followed it. Then I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. Adrian nodded once and stood from the table, adjusting his jacket with the same quiet confidence he carried everywhere. As he prepared to leave, he paused beside the table and looked at me again. "Emily," he said. "Yes." Adrian slipped his hands into the pockets of his coat and spoke with the same calm certainty he had used outside under the streetlight. "Respect," he said slowly, "is a rare thing in the world. Most people try to buy it." I waited, sensing he had not finished. Adrian continued. But the interesting people are the ones who cannot be bought. For a moment, the restaurant lights reflected softly in the polished floor between us. Then Adrian Romano gave a small nod and turned toward the exit, walking calmly through the dining room while conversations quietly resumed around him. I watched him leave through the glass doors into the Manhattan night, and for the first time since the strange moment with the dollar bill, I realized something important. Some customers left tips, but Adrian Romano had left something else entirely. A question that was only beginning to matter.